So in this video, I'm going to talk about how Christianity gave birth to modernity, and it's going to be a bit of a critique of Christianity, because I'm going to adopt the metamodernist and integral theory view of history, which takes into consideration the different developmental stages and the different mental structures that we see in the history of humanity. So, a mental structure is a dominating set of qualities that humanity has during a particular time in history in their consciousness. So, this gives us different values and different perceptions. And every time that there is a mutation, a shift, there usually is a good reason for that shift towards a different mental structure. But the thing is that there's also a repression of something which is valid. So I'm going to look at Christianity in this sense as repressing something which was valid in the previous mental structures. And it's not going to be a critique like it is usually seen in people like Nietzsche or in people who adhere to a scientific point of view, who say that Christianity is closed-minded, it's dogmatic, and so on, or from a political point of view, which stresses the fact that Christianity was too strict, and particularly in regards to sexuality, and this is why we have these tendencies of like sexual liberation, and it's a reaction to what Christianity has been doing along the centuries. So I'm not going to go into that. My critique will come from the opposite direction, actually. It will start from the point of view of the ancients. It's not going to view Christianity negatively from a modernist perspective, because I think that critique is kind of flawed. It has some value, yes, it has some value, but I think that it represses a lot of good stuff that you can still find in Christianity. And this is to be seen within the framework that I mentioned before of metamodernism and of the repression of the qualities of the previous mental structures which were dominating human consciousness. So before Christianity, in ancient times, we had animism and a mythological type of mental structure. And in animism, you had a living cosmos. So behind physical processes and behind plants, behind trees, and so on, you would always find spiritual beings, elemental beings, beings which took a part in nature and were not visible to the naked physical eye. So they were behind the scenes. And people who were describing these realities were actually perceiving these entities. At least this is my own interpretation of what was going on back then. And we still have shamans, we still have people living in the jungle or in nature who practice shamanism, and they still have this clairvoyant view, this clairvoyant qualities and capabilities. And they still describe the nature spirits. And science tries to say that, well, no, these people are just trying to find explanations for physical phenomena that they cannot explain otherwise because they don't have the means to do so because they do not possess science. They do not possess scientific knowledge. And they view these people as primitives, and I think this is wrong. I think this is not the correct way to view how the ancients were. And they do the same thing when they look at the ancient myths of the Greeks, of the Egyptians, and so on. And to be fair, a lot of myths, they're just allegories. They're just symbols for some processes that occur in nature. Usually, you will find the actions of the gods and the gods themselves as representing the passing of the seasons and so on. And this also uh, points to the fact that the ancients had a different view of time that we have. So these myths, which represent like the cyclical nature of time, they are pointing to the fact that the ancients view time in a different way than we do, and they viewed it cyclically. And we can see this in all of their culture, basically. If you look at literature, what was the form which was predominant back then? It was poetry. It wasn't prose, it was poetry. So if you look at ancient times, poetry is dominating more than prose. And poetry has a certain cyclical nature to it. Poetry has rhythm, which is more obvious than prose. So poetry is more in tune with the natural cyclical way of things. And the ancients were actually using it because it was in tune with their view of time. And another thing which was also to be seen in the cyclical nature is, or the cyclical view of time, is the cycles themselves of like the different epochs that the ancients had, like the Bronze Age, the Golden Age, the Silver Age, the Iron Age, and so on. And you had the Yugas and so on. And then in their theology, there was a transmigration and metempsychosis. And I know there's a debate about this. I know the traditionalist esotericist Rene Guénon was saying that the ancients weren't actually believers in reincarnation. They used transmigration as a theory to claim that the soul goes from different states of being, from different levels of reality, and the soul never returns to a physical body. It never returns to Earth. And metempsychosis, according to Rene Guénon, was the passage of certain psychic residue to another person when someone had passed away. So the reason why some kids remember past lives, remember the past lives of a person which was then identified or is then identified by a researcher as having actually lived the life from the memory of the kid, is because you have this psychic residue which attaches itself to someone else when that person passed away. So I think Guénon was wrong. I think Guénon didn't didn't portray reincarnation or transmigration or metempsychosis as the ancients actually did. And he was claiming that reincarnation as it is today was the doing of certain socialists from like the France of his time, or actually before that, from the 19th century. And it was then adopted by the Theosophists. And the reason why Rene Guénon is wrong about this is because if you look at the ancient traditions that we have, well, they are saying that you can indeed return in a physical body as a soul. You can reincarnate. And Rene Guénon was saying that this is just a modern invention, that in the past nobody believed in reincarnation. But if you read Plato in Timaeus, he explicitly says that yes, you can return in a physical body. You can reincarnate. He says that for the souls who were not living according to the laws of nature, who were living in a bad way, and they would have to return basically as either a woman or a an animal. And it's interesting because if you look at the various traditions of the past, you always have a certain hierarchy. You have the level of humans, you have the level of demons, of ghosts, of animals, and of gods, and so on. And you usually reincarnate in one of those states, but you can also return as a human. The difference with Theosophy is that Theosophy views reincarnation as a process which happens mostly on the human level. So you won't reincarnate as an animal that much. You always reincarnate as a person. So this is the new thing which was brought by Theosophy, basically. And why am I mentioning reincarnation so much? Well, because Christianity, when it appeared, well, it adopted another kind of view of time. So, in the tradition of Judaism, well, Judaism is more of a historical religion, as Mircea Eliade says, which means that what is contained in the Bible is to be considered as history. So, the Bible is the history of a certain ethnic group, which has its own events, its own struggles, its own sufferings, and it culminates in the New Testament, and this is how it gives birth to Christianity. And Christianity, well, at the beginning, there were different factions within the church, or that which will or become the church in the future. And the different factions were like the more Judaic factions and the more Hellenistic factions, which included the Gnostics. And the Gnostics got kicked out of the church, and they had different ideas. They were closer to Platonism, despite the fact that Neoplatonists were very critical of them, but they were adopting a lot of that thinking in their theology, basically. And they were the ones who also had the ideas of reincarnation. At least it seems so. And what happened is that the faction which won was more of a, let's say, centrist one, the proto-Orthodox, which included elements of both Judaism and Hellenism. And out of that synthesis, the thing is that they chose certain elements from Judaism which prevailed overall over the Hellenistic side. So the cyclical nature of time disappeared in Christianity, and you had this linear view of time, and reincarnation disappeared from Christianity. And what substituted reincarnation is basically the conception of the soul at birth. So the soul started to coincide more and more with the physical body. So your existence is unique in Christianity. And this is also tied to the incarnation of the Christ in a physical body and the resurrection of the physical body. And as you can see, everything is tied to physicality more and more in Christianity. And this is also to be seen in its symbolism. This is a speculation of mine, but the reason why we have the Holy Trinity as it is, because it's a bit ambiguous. Like it's God is one and three at the same time. It's a weird concept to have, but that reason, at least to my mind, it's a bit symbolical, because the triangle as it is kind of represents the three coordinates of space, so three-dimensionality. So it's a symbol for um, the physical reality. So the emphasis on the three persons in the Trinity, to my mind, with that kind of symbolism, uh, goes to show in an unconscious way how Christianity is more tied to, let's say, physicality in the physical body and so on. Because you could have basically just said that uh, there is one God, and then you have a manifestation of three persons out of that. But that is not the phrasing of it. It's more paradoxical. It's more fusioned. It's more tied together than that. And yeah, what happens is that your life is basically just this one. There's an emphasis on the uniqueness of life, and once you die, and you wait for the coming of the Messiah, of the second coming of the Messiah. Um, uh, Basically, Judgment Day, the eschatological uh, moment of Christianity, where you will have the resurrection of the physical body, which will be transformed, glorified, and so on, but it's still the same physical body that you had in the past. So there's no space for reincarnation in Christianity. And this is tied with its emphasis on the body. Everything becomes more materialized in some way. You can see this in the dogma, and you can see this also in what the heresiologists were writing back then. So they were attacking paganism, they were attacking the Chaldeans, astrology, and so on. So they weren't attacking atheists that much because we didn't have a lot of atheists back then. What we had were pagans and pagan beliefs. So they were attacking astrology. They were saying that, well, it's just let's say a pseudoscience, though they didn't use that terminology, but they were saying that astrologers were charlatans, and I think, yeah, that can be a fair assessment up to a point. But the thing is that what happened is that an ancient framework was starting to crumble. So basically, the view of the cosmos as being alive, as being this not just mechanical clock that was working in a precise order, but as something having a soul and being alive. Because in astrology, well, there is no official explanation of why you have these influences of the planets, but if you go into some esoteric traditions, well, the claim is that the planets are alive and that the universe is alive. And this is why astrology can function in that sense. But in Christianity, well, the way you see the heresiologists like Hippolytus of Rome attack the astrologers, you'll see that this view is lost. And if you talk to theologians from today, Orthodox theologians, Christian theologians, not all of them, because there are some exceptions, and there have been Christian astrologers, but if you talk with these people, you will see that they view the planets only as rocks, flying in the sky, flying in the space, and the Earth is just a rock. And this view coincides with modernity. This view is precisely what we have in modernity. So when you had the switch between geocentrism and heliocentrism, basically what you had was the arguments that, well, we are not at the center of the universe anymore, and we are losing this let's say, subjective perspective, and we are not placed in an, an order anymore, and the Earth is just a rock wandering around in space. Well, it's the same thing that Christians are actually proposing now. So the view that modernists were proposing back then in the Renaissance, when Galileo Galilei appeared and Kepler and Copernicus appeared, they were basically proposing this heliocentric view, which disrupted the natural order that was dominant at that time. And Earth wasn't to be considered as important as it had been before. And the same view of Earth being just a rock floating in space, you find that in Christianity, paradoxically, in the heresiologists, and in modern theologians. And this is not a coincidence. This is by far not a coincidence, because there is a trend towards materialism in Christianity. And you look at how Christianity has treated mysticism over the years, how it has treated its mystics over the years, and how it has treated its mystical theology over the years. And you find very interesting patterns, because the church hasn't been that open to mysticism. And it's curious, why is Christianity not open to a direct contact to God that much? Why is it not promoting that? And why the people who reach certain heights of mystical experiences, why are they deemed heretical by the church? So you had the case of Meister Eckhart, for example. He was considered a heretic. And some time ago, I wanted to return to Orthodox Christianity, so I started to read a major Romanian theologian named Dumitru Stăniloae, and I read a book of his on asceticism. So from the first pages, he was talking about Meister Eckhart, and he was describing him as being pantheist. So Meister Eckhart, according to the major theologian of Orthodox Christianity in Romania, was a pantheist, which is weird because he is not a pantheist. And this was endorsed by the patriarch of the church, this view, in the preface of the book. And it's very interesting. Why are they accusing Eckhart of being a pantheist when he is not a pantheist? He's a panentheist, which includes transcendence, basically. So pantheism is the belief that God is the same as reality, or the same as the world, and God is basically equal to substance. And panentheism doesn't say that. Panentheism says that God is the basis, the ground for reality, but he is not equal. He is transcendence itself, but at the same time, paradoxically, he has to be immanent in some ways, but he is not equal to substance. So it's interesting that you find this thing in Christianity. It's interesting that you find this dismissal of mysticism so much, and this misunderstanding of mysticism, because, well, the trend actually goes to show that Christianity has been going more and more towards a materialist view of reality. And when you look at how the Gnostics were treated, and not because of their, let's say, more controversial ideas, but the fact that they emphasize gnosis of the spiritual world. And if you look at how modern Christians view reality itself, you'll find out that, well, there's not much of a difference between a secularist and a Christian. Because usually Christians have this box of theirs where they keep their faith. Yeah, they go to church, they participate to mass, and they have this personal belief, but their overall theology does not influence their life that much, or it does not influence how they view reality. So it's ironic how also the theologians, the priests, and so on, and not all of them, of course. I'm sure that there are some who have a similar view to mine, but from what I've seen, uh, it's interesting how they get so triggered when uh, you talk about Jung or someone who has a more syncretic point of view and is dealing with spiritual traditions which are different from Christianity, and they are finding value in that. And basically, the reaction to that is one of, let's say, condemnation, of saying, well, that belongs to the devil. If you practice meditation, if you practice yoga, if you research esotericism or different traditions, then you are basically falling into a trap of the devil. And if you ask these same people about secularism, about how they live their lives, in respect to technology, in respect to all that modernity has brought to us, well, there's no sign of, let's say, being worried about where all of this comes from and why we have all that we have. So it's ironic that they don't see that society as it is now, meaning secular, is a product of an atheistic ideology, which by definition is considered of the devil, or by definition should be considered by the devil, from the devil. It's ironic that they don't see that as a problem, because they participate in that as well, and they kind of agree with the core values of it. So, what I'm seeing is a kind of psychological blockage that Christians have when you are trying to go into metaphysics, when you are trying to go into mysticism. They will say that, well, you're not prepared yet for that. You are not humble enough for that, to talk about that. Why should you go into that? Because the thing is that mysticism and the connection that you have to God, well, that should be the core element in Christianity or in any religion. And it's ironic that when you mention that, you get a reaction which is the opposite of what should be, actually. So, what I'm seeing is a lot of Christians behave like secularists, they think like atheists, they think like skeptics, and they are not spiritual enough. They keep their spirituality in a box, and it's all related with their needs. It's not something which is of, let's say, theological or world value. It's something which is related to their own personal lives. And this is not a bug, this is a feature which you can find in Christianity. And this is my problem with it. And it's also the fact that it's very tribalistic. I've been to Mass once in a monastery, and the priest there was saying that all our saints are beautiful, while all the idols of the pagans are ugly. And that statement alone is just false. Well, are we talking about aesthetics now? Because look at ancient Greek statues. Look at the gods, how they were portrayed. They were portrayed in a very perfect fashion. How can you say that those statues are ugly? They're not ugly. They're better than what you can find in some portrayals of the saints of the church, basically. So, what I'm seeing is this tribalistic kind of thinking, this dogmatic way of thinking, and it's been there since the beginning, it seems. It's not something new, but the thing is that this way of viewing reality, this descent into materialism, into the physical body, this eschatological view, this linear time from Christianity and Judaism, this kind of changed the world as it is. And this led to modernity, postmodernity, and what we have now. With its morality and with its conceptions which made the cosmos become less alive, less soulful, and with less emphasis on the need for a spiritual experience and spiritual knowledge of the higher worlds. So, to wrap this up, basically, my claim is that with Christianity, you have the installment of linear time preferred to cyclical time, which was the time adopted by ancient religions and ancient traditions. And this changed everything. This is to be seen also in the doctrine, this is to be seen in the way that Christians view the soul and the relationship that the soul has with the body, and the fact that it doesn't return, it doesn't reincarnate in the sense of a cycle. It returns only at the end times. So you have an end times, you have an eschatology, something which was missing, for example, from Greek mythology, and you have this shared with Judaism instead. So in Christianity, you have all these elements which point to a progression, a linear time, which then is taken by modernity. And you know that modernity doesn't have a cyclical view of time, a cyclical view of reality. It adopts this progressive view, which you get from Christianity. So, as you can see, this framework, this temporal framework, influences all the ideas in the dogma and in let's say, what came after the dogma was dropped. And besides this, there's also the social and political element, because in Christianity, a lot of decisions had to be taken from a social and political point of view. So the doctrine and the dogma is influenced also by world events. It's not just pure metaphysics. So when you look at it, for example, filioque and the schism that happened between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, the reasons were theological on the surface, but if you look at what was happening, basically you had a political and social level which forced the Catholics to adopt that doctrine, which, at least to my mind, not necessarily as an Orthodox, but to my mind, doesn't make much sense. Uh, so you have a lot of stuff going on, and metaphysics and first principles are kind of left behind. And this is one of the biggest problems that I have. It's the, let's say, lack of interest in metaphysics and gnosis and the exploration of what lies beyond the physical. So while Christians don't have a problem with the advancement of technology, of the usage of the new technology that appears and so on, they don't seem to be very prone to explore what consciousness offers in altered states of mind, in altered states of consciousness. Because, of course, there's a lot of psychological resistance there, of course, but the dogma itself doesn't actually promote that. And if you read some of the theologians and saints, they advise also not paying attention to dreams because they come from the devil and stuff like that. So there are a lot of problems which come from the framework and the social conditions in which Christianity was created.